Okay, hello everyone and welcome to the PFCC Partners Community of Practice Workshop. I am Lindsay Galley, I'm the Director of Education at PFCC Partners and thrilled to have our presenters from the National Academy of Medicine with us today. They will be talking about leveraging the Assessing Community Engagement conceptual model to advance health equity through transformed systems for health. So before I pass the presentation along, I'm just going to do some quick housekeeping and then introduce our presenters. First things first, we are recording this session and it will be added to the PFCC Partners YouTube playlist where you can find all of our past community of practice workshops as well. That is a good reminder also for me to turn on live transcript for anyone who needs it. So live transcript is on. Throughout our session today, if you have any questions that come up for the presenters, we're going to have plenty of time at the end of the session for Q&A. So if those questions do come up while the presentation is going, please put them in the chat. One of the presenters will be able to answer it, or we'll hold it for the Q&A session at the end. It looks like a lot of you have found the chat box, but if you haven't yet, you can find that on your Zoom toolbar. So if you hover on your screen, you can find the toolbar with the chat box, with your mute button if you have some background noise, and if with your camera that you can turn on and off as well. If you're in a good place to turn your camera on, we love to see everyone's smiling faces. All right, and we are PFCC Partners. Our organization is a patient-driven organization with a mission to center the inclusive human experience of health and reinvent through radical collaboration and really be a catalyst for system transformation. What we want to see over the next 20 years is a health system that is transformed and one that works with people and through communities as a partner in their well-being. And we kind of really built off what the National Academy of Medicine did with this model to transform our mission and vision, and of course our values as well. So that's why I think we're all so excited to have the team joining us here today. Our values include equity, inclusion, diversity, collaboration, and solution focused. We also fully support and facilitate the Patient Family Advisor Network, or PFA Network, which is a community of patients and family caregivers, all serving in the role of patient family advisor. We have opportunities to engage with healthcare partners all across the country to share your own lived experiences in healthcare to inform healthcare improvement. We have like I said, a large community that you can connect with for peers, peer learning, and then skills development or skills exchange, just opportunities to continue to build your knowledge of how to partner really effectively in healthcare. So we can send more information as always, but that is us. But more importantly, this is our presentation today. So I wanted to quickly introduce our presenters and then I will pass it along. So first we have Ayatollah Anashe, who is the Deputy Director for the National Academy of Medicine Leadership Consortium Collaboration for a Learning Health System. In this role, Ayatollah translates the mission and vision of the Leadership Consortium into strategic approaches across the areas of culture, inclusion, and equity, evidence generation, digital health, and value incentives and systems. Prior to this role, Ayatollah served as the Director of Value and Culture with the Leadership Consortium, where she directed efforts that focused on transitioning health payments from fee-for-service to value and population health, as well as individual and community strategies and equity approaches for health improvement. So Ayatollah will kick us off, but we also have Julie Tarrant, who is an Associate Program Officer at the National Academy of Medicine, where she supports the Culture of Health program and the Assessing Meaningful Community Engagement in Health and Healthcare project of the Leadership Consortium Collaboration for a Learning Health System. Previously, she was the Director of Production and Editorial Quality at a digital fundraising and advocacy firm in DC, serving clients that include organizations combating climate change and environmental threats, educator burnout, and gun violence. Her volunteer experience includes grant writing to support mutual aid efforts and tutoring first-generation college aspirants. And last but not least, we have Asia Williams, who is an Associate Program Officer at the National Academy of Medicine Leadership Consortium Collaboration for a Learning Health System. And in this role, she supports the Culture, Inclusion, and Equity Action Collaborative and the Action Collaboratives focused on digital health and evidence mobilization. Before this role, Asia attended Drexel University, where she studied health management and policy and received her MPH. At Drexel, she also conducted quality improvement research for intensive care units at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital and federally qualified health centers for the Philadelphia Department of Public Health. She has strong interest in social determinants of health research, as well as promoting patient, family, and community engagement in the development and implementation of health and healthcare programs and policies. So very excited again for all of these three to be joining us today and presenting. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Ayadola.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you for having us. As you can see, there are three of us from the National Academy of Medicine who are going to be presenting, but we are presenting on behalf of a whole lot of people who have helped to shape this work in some way, shape, or form. Before we begin, I just want to let you all know that I'm going to be going on a little bit of a thank you tour because there are a lot of people who deserve some thanks in some way, shape, or form for us being here. So first, let me thank PFCCpartners, Libby, Lindsay, and the team for having us here. I also want to, in the beginning, thank Asia and Julie, who are two of the hardest working people that I have had the pleasure of working with. They have really helped to shape this work along with our organizing committee, who I will talk about a little bit later. Can you go to the next slide? Continuing with the thank you tour, I have to also give a lot of thanks to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Mona Shaw and Monique Shaw have just been tremendous allies and partners in this work. You know, they really believe in this work. And that's, you know, often sometimes really challenging to advance with funders. So we're grateful for them. And if you're keeping track, the fourth set of thank yous goes to you, the audience, for joining us today. So we're excited to be able to share with you what we've been working on for the past several years. Next slide. So today, what we're going to go over with you is some background on the work that we've been doing on assessing meaningful community engagement. So we'll define meaningful community engagement, the reason that we should assess community engagement, and we'll talk about this project. We will talk about the conceptual model. We have a commentary that's been released, and we'll share that link with you so that you can access it. But more importantly, you all get a sneak peek into some of the additional resources that we're producing through this work. So we're going to talk about the impact stories, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the assessment instruments as well. Next slide. So let's dig into defining and assessing meaningful community engagement. Next slide. So as we started this work, there was a need for us to think about what we meant by communities. And that's often what we're asked, because when people hear the term community, they think, oh, okay, people who live in the same geographic area. And in fact, we knew that for some people who align with this work, that might be the case, but for others, that would not be the case. And so we are defining community here as something that is broad. So it could be a group of people who are connected by geography, but it could also be a group of people who are connected by similar situations and want to address the things that are affecting the well-being of people. And so for us, when we say community, that could mean patients, it could mean caregivers, it could mean multi-stakeholder collaboratives, it could mean people who are interested in sickle cell, it could mean people who are interested in other health conditions. It has the ability to mean a lot of different things. And so we leave it up to groups to decide what communities they want to represent. That said, what do we mean when we say meaningful community engagement? And you have the definition on the slide, and this is a definition that comes from Principles of Community Engagement, a work that was produced in 1997 by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Lucky for all of us, they are going through and updating this document and producing the 3rd edition, which I believe should be out this year or early next year. But this is where we've taken our definition for meaningful community engagement. So not only is it about engaging and working collaboratively with and through people who represent community, again, however you choose to define it, but meaningful community engagement is engagement that ultimately results in changes, what I like to call tectonic shifts that leave you different, that leave you better than when you started. So that's kind of how we are gauging whether engagement is meaningful. Is it changing your relationships among the people who you're partnered with? Is it mobilizing resources and influencing systems? And is it serving as a catalyst for changing policies, programs, and practices? This is ultimately the definition that we are using to make sure that engagement is meaningful. Next slide. So one of the things that we've noticed is that we are seeing more and more variation in the type of community engagement that's taking place. We've talked about what meaningful community engagement is, but we know that as hospitals, health systems, funders, funding agencies, researchers are reaching out and connecting more and more with communities, with patients, that the way they're doing that is shifting. And so some people feel like, oh, you know, I've shared this flyer with the community, with the patients, that's enough, I've engaged community. And then you have people who also think of engagement as them deferring to the communities, where the community is giving them guidance, is giving them direction, and has decision-making authority. And then you have all of the steps in between of consulting, involving, and collaborating. There is so much variation. And often informing is important and needed, and often deferring to is important and necessary. And so really trying to think about what is important for community engagement and making sure that assessing that engagement to understand if it's meeting the needs of the groups that you're working with is something that's really critical. But again, we're seeing such variation in how it's done. Next slide. And then also, as we're seeing variation, we want to just put a stake in the ground to say that there are some things that do not constitute community engagement. Conducting one focus group, focus group, that's not meaningful community engagement. If you're working on a research project and you have 5% of someone's time and effort accounted for on the budget, that probably is not meaningful community engagement. And it certainly isn't doing a checkbox approach where you have one of each person or you know, that is represented in your group, and then you believe that you have meaningful community engagement. It takes a lot more than that. Next slide. We want to make sure that we can get to authentic and sustainable community engagement, and that it is integral to advancing health equity and eradicating barriers to community well-being. And while we have this goal, and it's one that, you know, we believe at the NAM is hard work, but it's heart work as well, we realize that there are not a lot of measurement practices that are readily accessible and available to folks who want to understand if the engagement that they are doing is meaningful. And so there was a need to provide and present and share strategies and resources. Next slide. So that's the background of how we got to this particular project. And so the project goal is to help to build a menu of effective evidence-based community engaged indicators and metrics that can be used to measure meaningful community engagement. And it's important that these indicators and metrics be available, bless you, and useful to individuals, families, and community groups in a wide range of settings, and that they can help to characterize, track, motivate, and guide progress to shape healthcare programs and policies, with a special emphasis on communities that are most in need. There are a couple of things that I want to touch on here, because the work that we are doing here is really geared towards a broad, wide range of audiences. Can you go to the next slide, please? We want to make sure that anyone who is touching engagement has the opportunity to use these indicators and metrics. So our audiences are broad. The potential topics that they can be used for are broad as well. And so in terms of the audiences, we want this to be accessible for federal and state and local agencies, for tribal communities, for advocacy and community-based groups, for funders, academic institutions, care systems, health centers, hospitals, as well as payers, plans, and industry. Again, a wide range of audiences. And as we're talking about the range of audiences, I also want to share that we realize that this has the opportunity to influence a lot of programs and policies. And we know that health is made up of more than just you're going to the hospital, that it's made up and comprised of where you live, where you play, where you work, and where you pray. All of these things affect your health. And so we believe that people who are working to improve housing, people who are working to improve climate, food insecurity, that these resources will also be available to them. So even though as we move forward, you'll hear us say health and healthcare, just know that you don't necessarily need to be directly working in these spaces for these resources to be available to you. Next slide. And so I mentioned earlier that I needed to also kind of continue a round of thank yous. And so thanks goes to our amazing organizing committee. And so you see a lot of smiling faces here. These are the people, the 34 people who have really been influential in helping to support this work. So the organizing committee represents community leaders, researchers, and policy experts. There is a wide range of diversity in our committee, from a geographic perspective, from a race and ethnicity perspective, nationality, other abilities, sexual orientation, and gender identity. We've just learned a lot from them. The one thing that I want to point out is that there is a space in the bottom right-hand corner, and that space is unintentionally left blank, but I'm intentionally going to tell you what it's used for now. Once you've learned about this work,
it's not working and all that.
And once you've had the opportunity to look at and use these resources and start to put them to use, your picture goes here. You instinctively become a part of this committee, a part of developing, sharing, assessing, and changing the practice of community engagement. Next slide. All right, so these are the foundational standards for how we approached this work. In the interest of time, I'm actually not going to talk through them, but just to say that we have been very intentional about making sure that as we are doing work in meaningful community engagement, that we are meaningfully engaging those who are a part of this work as well. And so they really helped to shape these principles in terms of making sure that this work resonates with a range of people for a range of things. Next slide. All right, so our project at a glance. This is 4 years in the making. I don't know how many of you know about elephants, but elephants, the gestational period for an elephant is about 18 months. And so we joke among the committee about how we've kind of gone through and birthed 2 baby elephants. But we have 34 organizing committee members in total. We added 13 to the original group, 13 community leaders to the original group so that we had more inclusion. This was about community, so we needed to increase the level of involvement of community leaders. We have had probably at this point over 24 meetings of the entire organizing committee, and we've been producing a set of resources that we hope will be really helpful and useful to you all, again, as we practice community engagement. Next slide. Next slide. The last thing that I want to say before I turn it over to my colleague Asia is that we I talked earlier about systems, processes, and policies changing as the result of community engagement, and that's how you know that it's meaningful. Well, as we've done our own community engagement for this work, we've experienced our own tectonic shifts that have left us changed forever. And so I just want to highlight, and you see this slide that shows the ways in which community engagement has produced significant shifts in our work. And so I just want to share with you that we're walking the walk and we're talking the talk about meaningful community engagement. So with that, let me pass it over to Asia.
Thanks, Idella, and thanks, Lindsay, for changing the slide. So hi, everyone, I'm Asia. I'm so happy to be here and adding my thanks to Idols. Thankful for you all for attending. So to start off, I'm just going to spend a little time sharing key process elements of engaging our organizing committee members in the development of this first resource, which is our conceptual model. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Julie, to present the model itself. Next, please, Lindsay. Okay, so at the beginning of this project, our organizing committee members felt that there was a need for a conceptual model, and the committee studied several models to try to fit that need, but they felt that the current models were missing elements of importance to this project. Starting with the elements on the slide that Idola shared briefly on our foundational standards. So, for example, we wanted a model that could apply to a wide range of communities and end users, one that embedded equity, and of course, one that associated engagement to improved health and healthcare outcomes. So with that, we set out to develop a new model. Next, please, Lindsay. So these are our wonderful community leaders from the larger organizing committee group who were just instrumental in the development of a conceptual model that really fit the context of this project. Next, please, Lindsay. And as a part of that development process, we engaged them in a lot of discussion, but it wasn't just us asking them what they wanted, but having really iterative conversations about what should be included and the language we should be using to convey that. So asking, does this specific word capture your feelings, your thoughts, and your experiences? And can you really see your voice in this, this language? So here's some of those quotes from really insightful conversations. Next, please, Lindsay. And from those conversations, we identified 71 outcomes or measurement indices that were represented by 19 indicators, which were then organized into 5 categories of overarching outcomes, which we call our domains. And Julie will dive more into this terminology when I hand things over. But now that we have our domains and indicators, I wanted to talk briefly about the process of designing the model structure, housing all this information. Next, please. Okay. So these are 8 prototypes that we went through. I will say there are a few previous design attempts made by a subset of the committee that are not here, but luckily we were able to get great design support from Kim Irwin and Tomoko Ichikawa at the IIT Institute of Design, who were really able to just bring our vision, especially a community leader's vision, to life. But with the 8 you see here, you'll see that each visual was optimized for a primary goal, and an ongoing challenge that we were facing actually in this process was trying to distinguish visually the engagement process itself from the engagement outcomes. So that's a constant theme across these images, and I'll highlight one design in particular that was kind of our moment of clarity. Next, please, Lindsay. That was a number 6. And really just what distinguishes this design was that engagement was centered in the middle of the model, and the outcomes incorporated are around the engagement. So from these 8 prototypes led to our final model design. So I'll turn it over to Julie now to present the model.
Thank you, Asia. I'll lean on my colleagues. Thanks to all of you and to all the many, many people and expertise and insight that went into making this model. It's a pleasure to be with you today and a privilege to present on the components of the conceptual model. So thank you, Lindsay, for moving forward. So breaking down the model here, we really wanted to start with the central focus of the model, which is community engagement. And, community engagement for us represents the start and the hub of movement toward outcomes. Next slide, please. And then we have the core principles that identify the attributes that should be present in meaningful community engagement. So it should be grounded in trust. It should be designed for bidirectional influence and information flow between communities and partners. It should be inclusive, culturally centered, equitably financed, and built on the knowledge of communities and partners. It should be built with shared governance. It should be ongoing and co-created, and it should be co-equal with communities and partners considering themselves and each other equal partners in terms of influence and value on the project. So the process of engagement that uses these principles is critical, and that's what allows us to move to outcomes. Next slide, please. So the outcomes, these are what really help us determine if meaningful engagement is present. And we've divided them into 4 domains. They can be petals. We've heard them called petals or propellers. So whatever they look like to you, under each domain, there are indicators, the 19 indicators that Asia mentioned, which are associated with specific metrics that will be released in the coming months. And Asia will talk through those shortly as well. So I'll go through each of the 19 indicators because they are so important. And as Asia said, we're developed with real intent and a lot of deep discussion with our partners. But I ask you to bear with me, but I'll also encourage you to think about what these concepts, whether these terms or other terms, what they may mean in your communities and in your work as we go through them. So under the strengthened partnerships and alliances, these indicators are really meant to highlight the benefits of new or improved relationships. And they include diversity and inclusivity, partnerships and opportunities, acknowledgement, visibility, and recognition, sustained relationships, mutual value, trust, shared power, and structural supports for community engagement. The second petal is expanded knowledge. And by that, we mean the creation of insights, new resources, stories, and evidence, as well as generating respect.
Do you want to take the kids to?
As well as respect for culturally embedded ways of knowing. So these indicators include new curricula strategies and tools, bidirectional learning, and community-ready information. Going to the third petal is improved health and healthcare programs and policies. So the committee identified these indicators that allow for developing solutions that communities want and will use, that are embraced and championed by those that they're intended to serve. So these indicators include community-aligned solutions, actionable, implemented, and recognized solutions, and sustainable solutions. And in the fourth petal, you'll see is thriving communities. And so indicators under this include physical mental health, improved community capacity and connectivity, community power, community resiliency, and life quality and well-being. So ultimately, with community engagement and its core principles embedded into the collaborations and partnerships, we think that movement and progress should occur in multiple domains and indicators here. Next slide, please. And so with that movement within the domains and the indicators, that will ultimately facilitate action toward health equity through transformed systems for health. And as Idola mentioned in talking about audiences, these systems for health are really inclusive of all systems that influence and impact health. And we also recognize that there are contextual factors around the model that influence our work in community engagement. So if you'll squint and peer at the screen, I'll read them out as well. But those are drivers of health and the social determinants of health, drivers of change in health and healthcare. So the key levers that influence stakeholder action and include things from grassroots organizing to regulations to financial incentives and much more. And then there are the social, political, racial, economic and financial context that underpins all community engagement efforts. So community engagement exists within these systems, and the organizing committee ultimately believes that community engagement can shift not only the outcomes in the models and not only equity and systems for health, but that community engagement also has the opportunity to shift these contextual factors as well. Next slide, please. So here's a little build through of kind of showing you how the model can be fleshed out. And the model really reflects what we know community engagement to be, which is dynamic and transformative. And when communities are actively and meaningfully engaged, we can catalyze and accelerate the paradigm shift toward health, toward equity and toward transformed systems for health. So if you'll go through that, Lindsay has a beautiful little image. Now it really looks like petals with everything kind of coming forward. Thank you. And I'll go ahead and keep the mic as we transition next. Lindsay, if you can go to the next slide, and I'll talk through the project's impact stories. Next slide, please. So as is well reflected in the conceptual model, we know that community engagement is not a single event, not a goal, not a checkbox, but it's a complex and dynamic process that changes across time and location. And the organizing committee wanted to share real stories of community engagement told by the individuals involved in that work to demonstrate the different approaches to engagement, different approaches to how it's evaluated and how it can lead to different, to improved outcomes when it's done meaningfully. Next slide, please. So the organizing committee initially shared 23 stories, and subsets of the committee continued refining and shaping what these stories ultimately looked like during really deep discussions in various work groups. And the goal was, really just to ensure that these stories rang true with the organizing committee and reflected these key criteria that were identified to make sure these are compelling stories of meaningful engagement. Next slide. So we worked with a human-centered designer, Kim Irwin, and held interviews with the storytellers and the community members so they could really share about the process and impact of their community engagement work in their own words. And we wanted to make the stories accessible, authentic, and contextual. So accessible in that they are easy to understand by a range of audiences, using different media to tell the story creatively and compellingly. We wanted them to be authentic and that there are really clear and concrete examples of engagement, not glossing over the process by saying we engaged people, right? And then contextual in the sense that these are snapshots of the storyteller's perspective at that time, at that moment of community engagement when they were telling the story. So we wanted to make sure that the full context around that moment, all of the work that went into it, all of the experience and the time was reflected in the story as well. Next slide. So we went through kind of a review process as well with our organizing committee, again, really with those goals in mind. And we had originally developed 8 stories from the interview process. And during this review process, we asked the organizing committee to score them, each of the stories according to whether they are clear and easy to understand, whether they offer a compelling narrative of community engagement, and whether they offer a clear lesson for others looking to assess their engagement work. So, during review, the committee, the subset of the committee expressed concerns with one of the stories that didn't really get to that clarity, that didn't get to that compelling narrative of engagement that they felt the others did. So we removed it from the final group, and we're presenting these 7. And again, really, centering around that goal of making these really valuable, making them accessible, authentic, and contextual. Next slide. So here's an overview of, some quick facts about the stories. You can see they represent a wide range of engagement levels, communities and organizations, structures, geographical locations, and health topics. And we know that there's no, perfect approach. There's no right approach, one right way or outcome for community engagement and its assessment. So, as Idola was talking through, different communities may want different levels of engagement, want different outcomes. So we wanted to show what meaningful engagement could look like from different starting points and in different contexts. So for example, here, It Matters, there was a work that was representing more than 20 years of collaboration, really building on that momentum. While Ultimed, Heal Through PCOR, this story kind of reflects some early stages of building institutional infrastructure for engagement. The Health Equity Zone story relates how state level funding is promoting community power. Act Now Against Meth focuses on communities driving policy change at the county level. And then the Walkability Project tells a story of how a nonprofit, listened to residents and really redesigned a program to improve neighborhood level improvements. So again, each of these stories has a starting point and a context that's really critical. Next slide. So here you can see kind of the layout of the stories. This is a little sneak peek at what they'll look like when they're released, and kind of a look at how we, with really considerable and invaluable help from our human-centered designer, developed this rich story template around that goal of being, those three goals of being accessible, authentic, and contextual. So, every story has this kind of at-a-glance summary to give those quick details on the community type, the area of focus, the time frame, really making sure it's accessible, easy to get oriented. And then we wanted to make sure that the context is present to bring some of that authenticity. We know no work happens in a vacuum. So we gave the project background, what were their goals? What were their starting points for these activities? And where were they in the process of engagement? And then we wanted to be clear and specific again about those engagement activities, not saying they engaged and here we got to great outcomes, but really allowing the storytellers to describe what they did to engage. So, they will talk about going to backyard barbecues and meeting with community leaders and co-creating agendas over several months among partners, holding media events to mobilize the community around their priorities. So really getting specific. Next slide, please. And then we really wanted to, we knew that critical to being authentic is letting the storytellers tell their own stories and providing the context and the priorities and considerations that were important to them and their partners. So, we really see this as a great opportunity for readers to learn directly from the wisdom and knowledge of the engagement leader and community voices, which we've done, again, with a lot of help from our designer in video and audio clips that are really engaging and pull quotes so you can really get that direct experience. Next slide. And then we also have links so that readers can learn more about the depth of the work involved, including staying up to date with where the community and organizations are now. And the links also provide an avenue for the storytellers and communities to get their own traffic and their own traction directly for their work. Next slide. And finally, each story, the final section, really wraps up kind of with the project's outcomes and the alignment to the conceptual model. So the storytellers identified the core principles that were reflected in their work, as well as the outcomes that they were able to achieve through their community engagement. And when you've seen one community, you've seen one community. So we know that each of these stories have their own, again, starting points and context, and they reflect these individual perspectives of the storytellers and the community voices on this moment in time, in this snapshot, if you will, of this engagement. And it's not all or nothing. So we know that, again, communities want different things. And these storytellers picked the kind of menu items that were important to their partnership and work, and showed how their engagement process and assessing that process achieved meaningful outcomes. We know if the storytellers were asked the same questions in a year or 5 years or 10 years, that the engagement strategies and outcomes and learnings would look different, and they should. Next slide. So we have a little snippet, a little slice, some highlights from one of the stories, and this is from It Matters in Eastern Colorado. So you can see that this community research partnership was built on a network that was really established, I believe, in 1997. So, 20 plus years across rural and frontier counties in Colorado. And the partnership itself, was able to elevate and identify the need to build awareness and treatment access for opioid use disorder in their communities. And their engagement activities, including investing in these established, community relationships, really leaning on the work that they had done to build that connection. And they worked with community members to structure grant proposals to make sure that it really met community needs. They convened local community advisory councils to tailor intervention materials, including even a movie trailer that local theaters could play in advance of movies, to really kind of make sure that these materials were reaching the specific communities that they wanted to speak to. And so their outcomes included increased community awareness of resources and treatment options. They increased training and certification for providers in the region. And they saw an 87% increase in treatment for opioid use disorder compared to 65% increase in the rest of the state. And they have downloadable toolkits that folks can use to do similar work in their communities with resources and guides on their website. We provide links for that as well in the impact story. So this just gives a little bit of the sense of the richness and context that's available in the stories, and the wisdom and insights that can be gleaned by sharing and learning across community engagement efforts. Next slide. So you can see a visual here of how the storytellers identified their core principles and outcomes as it aligns with the conceptual model. And again, none of them tick off all of these, right? None of them kind of get everything. They really identify the elements that were important to their partnership and work. And in the stories, you can see how the engagement process and the assessment of that engagement achieved these meaningful outcomes. So the stories offer an opportunity to learn about aspects of community engagement, including those examples of process and how engagement can change and be changed by that process and its desired outcomes. So we hope that this inspires all of us to identify multiple entry points into the process of engaging and evaluating that engagement, including our own starting points. And I will close out this overview of the impact stories by saying, every community has a story, and these are 7 stories that were elevated from our organizing committee, but there are many, many more stories and communities that are not represented within these just 7 stories. So we really encourage seeking out stories from other communities to connect you with strategies that may be adaptable for use in your work and to inspire you to assess your community engagement. And with that, I will turn it back to Asia to continue walking through these resources.
Thanks, Julie. Next slide, please, Lindsay. Okay, so we're going to dive into our final resource for today's workshop, which are the assessment instruments. And basically how that came about was with the development of the conceptual model as our guide. It was time to fill in another gap, and that was that end users and their partners really needed specific measurement questions that were community engaged, effective, and evidence-based, that can connect the model and really help them assess whether they've been able to achieve the outcomes elevated by the model and that are of interest to them, but also to understand what are the potential areas for improvement. Next slide, please. Okay, so taking a step back to identify these specific questions, we conducted a literature search to see whether there were measurements already in existence that aligned with our model. So we gathered several forms of literature, articles, reports across these 5 databases to the left, and we used a combination of search terms related to engagement, measurement, and health. We also pulled literature from gray literature and unpublished manuscripts shared by our organizing committee members to really make sure we were covering all the bases. Next, please. So our vast search resulted in over 1,000 sources, and from there we started narrowing down the literature at the abstract / title level, and next at the full text level using set inclusion and exclusion criteria focused on engagement measurement. We eventually got to 80 articles that represented over 121 assessment instruments. And from there, we actually ended up prioritizing a smaller subset of articles and instruments so that we had a more manageable set of measures that we could share with everyone and crosswalk or map back to our model to identify that alignment we know would be of use to people. Next slide, please. So we spent a lot of time discussing with our organizing committee to identify the best prioritization criteria for our instruments. And after those discussions, we landed on the first. There needed to be a community engagement involved in the development, evaluation, or implementation of the instrument. And second, there needed to be some mention of validity and reliability testing in the article from which we were pulling information on the instrument. This intersection of engagement and scientific rigor was really important to address for our organizing committee to show that it's possible. So the outcome of applying that criteria was 28 assessment instruments that were developed as early as the 1990s or refined as recently as 2020. Instruments implemented mainly in the US and Canada, but also other countries around the world like Portugal, Malaysia, India, in diverse settings like community-based organizations, but also local government. So really they cover a wide variety of areas. Next, please. So to identify the alignment between the instrument questions in our model, we conducted 2 separate rounds of crosswalking between the two and adjudicated results for the final alignment. Here is another sneak peek example of how 2 questions fit into our model. While we're still compiling the data, I'll just quickly say that, there isn't a single domain and indicator pairing that isn't represented in these tools. So that's really important to highlight. Next, please. And to make these instruments and their alignment to the model more accessible, we're in the process of creating these summaries, which will feature background information that our organizing committee felt were important for potential end users to know in trying to pick what instrument might be best fit within the menu of options. So on the left or first page of the summary will be information on place and setting the instrument was tested in and with what populations, available translations and other background information. To the right, we'll highlight the conceptual model indicators represented in the instrument and then the specific question alignment. But I'll just end this portion by saying that, we recognize that others might interpret this alignment differently and crosswalk these questions elsewhere in the model, and that's more than okay. At the end of the day, we just wanted to provide a starting point for end users, and we actually encourage actively working with communities, with your partners to find the questions that work best for you and your partnership, and then adapt. So with that, next slide, please, Lindsay. I'll turn it over back to Ayadola.
Thank you, Asia. Thank you, Julie. So we have shared with you the conceptual model, which there is a link in the chat. And so you can learn more about the project, and you can go to the commentary and learn more about the conceptual model that we went over. We've also talked a little bit about the impact stories and the assessment instruments, which we are actively working on, and we are hoping that they will be completed and released this summer. And summer is all relative, so it's looking like it'll be September. But all of these resources together are just really important. And so we don't just want to release them and say, here they are, but we also want to be able to provide a guide, if you will, for how you might be able to use these, all of these tools. And, Asia started to allude to some of this, but, it's really important for communities, collaboratives to come together, look at the model and say, well, what is it that we want to work on? What principles are most important to us, and focusing on a handful, looking at the outcomes that are there and saying what outcomes are most important to us. It's not necessary for any group to try to cover all of them, but it is important to find a place to start. What's most important, and working together as a group to identify that, and then identifying the measures that you want to use to evaluate that. I know some of the questions that's going to come up either in this conversation or as we release these resources are around, well, how frequently should we do it? When should we do it? Who should we, and those are all really important questions. But the most important part is to sit down and start to have the conversation around what's important, what is meaningful for your team and for your collaborative and for your partners, and how to start moving that process along. So more to come, and we're just really grateful to be here to share with you where we are. And with that, Lindsay, let me hand it back to you to moderate the questions.
Great, thank you, Ayadola. Thank you, Asia and Julie as well. I have learned so much more about the model today, and I'm really excited about those impact stories. I think what I like the most is, how digestible it is, and that kind of, there's no wrong place to start as long as you're taking it one bite at a time and actually taking those steps forward towards community engagement. So thank you. And yes, I see Libby's comment in the chat. There are so many ways that we can apply this to the work that we do at PFCC Partners. So really appreciate each one of you elaborating a little bit more on the model. So we got a few comments and questions. I encourage everyone to add other questions to the chat, and please, you can raise your hand to come off mute as well if you would like to speak up and ask a question. First, we have Sarah Green, who added a comment: the inclusion of equitably financed as a core principle in the conceptual model is so important. Upholding this principle and attaining it at scale would be a game changer. Absolutely, it would. And then question from Stephanie, great presentation. Has National Academy of Medicine shared the resources that would allow us to develop meaningful impact stories? She would love to leverage the tools and processes you've developed instead of starting from scratch.
That is a great question. I know that we've talked about how important it is for communities to tell their own stories, because these 7 just really represent snapshots in time of like one perspective within a community. We don't have a template per se for how to develop your own, but I would say once we release the stories, you'll see the final template that we ultimately used. And so you can use that to start asking questions of your partners, right? To ask them questions about the project, to ask them, well, what were the key engagement activities that you felt were the secret sauce that made your work successful? And you can record these. And so you have the ability to create those audio clips and pull quotes, and then ask about the project outcomes. You might have to ask, well, why do you think that was important? Why did that happen? And then looking at, perhaps whether it's important to connect it to this conceptual model, you can make that decision. The other resource that is available, I don't know how many of you are familiar with NPR StoryCorps. They actually are a really great resource, and I think that they also have some guides and some questions that could be available for use as well.
Great, thank you. All right, we got a few more comments in chat. So this is going back to the equitably financed comment. So who determines the dollar amount for what is considered equitably financed?
Woo.
That
that is such a great question. I think earlier we were saying, if you have funding and you have 5% effort for someone to talk about community engagement or support community engagement, that's not helpful.
Right.
And I think here it's really important to facilitate conversations. Because I think, if we're talking about the research perspective, what oftentimes happens is the research community is like, okay, well, we'll give you X amount of money to do engagement, but they're not sitting down with the community partners to say, what do you need? What's important to you? How much should we be contributing from this contract or from this grant to the work of engagement? And that there also is an opportunity for communities or patient partners to say, I really want to be engaged in this work, but it needs to be equitable in terms of the financing for me. And so we think about it as a two-way street, with folks hopefully meeting somewhere in the middle. So we will not say what it is for any one community to get to equitable financing, but it's important for the community to be having that conversation so that they can arrive at what that means.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Another question from Jessica. Are there opportunities for further collaboration with you to help vet and or align their current work model with your found best practices?
We're always open for collaboration. I think one of the things that we stress in the commentary and that we'll stress here and moving forward is what you see here is really a first draft. It's an early draft. We believe that this is a living, breathing conceptual model. These resources are living and breathing, and that they should change over time. And the more people who see them, the more people who poke holes in them. We realize that the conceptual model doesn't include all the things that it should. And so collaboration and like you said, vetting is really important to understand what's missing and how to make sure that future iterations are more inclusive, are more aligned with a range of projects and a range of stakeholders and audiences.
Great, that's very exciting. Another question from Adam: did National Academy of Medicine assess the current extent and effectiveness of meaningful community engagement, say in public health, and the projected impact on any future instances? And oh, go ahead, Idle.
Oh, what a great question. We actually haven't done that assessment. We've looked in the literature, and Asia talked about what we're able to find in the literature in terms of measures, how we were able to narrow down the instruments to make sure that it's engagement and psychometric properties. But there's actually very little in the literature that talks about effectiveness in terms of, for example, health outcomes. If you engage, that influences, well-being, it influences, asthma or diabetes. There's little in the literature that makes that connection. Hopefully, by thinking about engagement in this way, it will allow people to start thinking about how engagement can influence various projects at different elements of it. And starting with the strengthened partnerships and alliances, moving to expanded knowledge, moving to community aligned solutions, and then improving on communities' ability to thrive in whatever ways that looks like for the community. We know that there's not a lot in the literature. We have not started to, delve specifically into that question, but I like the way you think, Adam, and maybe that's a follow-on activity.
Yeah. I think that is of very high interest to a lot of us in our community. So yeah, I would be interested in learning more. Okay, I think we'll go to these next two questions and then wrap up. You may have answered this one already, but Adeline asked, what are the tools being used to aggregate data to measure effectiveness?
So I would want to know a little bit more about measure effectiveness of what. I think that we have identified a lot of tools that have helped us to, for example, say if we want to influence trust or better understand trust, what does that look like? And what are the questions that you might want to ask to get at better understanding trust? If you are interested in shared power, what are the questions that you might want to ask to understand the ability of your collaborative to facilitate shared power and to carry that forward. And so depending on what you see as effectiveness, you have the range of measures that are available to you in terms of what you see in the conceptual model. Like I said, the conceptual model, it is not perfect. It is not inclusive of everything that's out there. And so you may identify other areas that are important to you in terms of effectiveness that you might want to look into. And so then it's important to see, okay, well, are there tools available for that? I will say, to give a shout out to some colleagues who are doing some important work in this area also. PCORI, I believe, recently released an award opportunity for folks to actually start to develop measures around engagement. And so there are some opportunities there because we know that not all of these tools are effective, not all of these tools are helpful, not all of these tools have been developed with communities in a really empowered way.
Definitely an evolution. Okay, so one last question from Patricia. Was there conversation regarding equity and workforce pipeline for healthcare? How do you use community engagement to inspire, recruit, train future community members for work in healthcare? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, what a great question. You know, we haven't necessarily thought about this as something that could be used, you know, for training or to guide conversations around workforce pipeline. But I think that this is just the conceptual model is a really good tool to at least start those conversations, because it's looking at, do you have the diversity and inclusivity? And so what does that look like, for example, for the workforce? So it's a starting point, but I don't think that we have had those explicit conversations. And maybe hopefully this is a tool that you can use to start those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you again, Ayadola, Asia, and Julie for this presentation today and spending a little extra time to answer some of the questions that we got as well. I'm going to go back through the chat because I think I missed a few things, but I believe Asia added the Leadership Consortium email there as well if you have other questions or would like to connect. So please use that. And thank you everyone for spending your Friday afternoon with us, and really grateful to the National Academy of Medicine and the three of you for bringing this really insightful work that will really change, you know, what community engagement looks like as we move forward. So thank you again, and happy Friday. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. Take care.